You're listening to Talking Freely, where we discuss culture, politics, and religious freedom. Talking Freely is a podcast from Freedom for Faith, a Christian legal think tank that exists to protect and promote religious freedom in Australia.
Welcome to Talking Freely. My name is Rowan McHugh. My guest today is Dr. Ryan T. Anderson, who is the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. He has authored several books, including Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom, and is the founding editor of Public Discourse, the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute. Dr. Anderson, welcome to Talking Freely.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
You were in Australia in 2015 during the same-sex marriage debate. Now that it's been legalized here and in America, what are some of the consequences you've witnessed, despite assurances it would not have an effect on religious freedom?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest consequence in that area has been to the ability of people who continue to believe the truth about marriage to live their lives in accordance with their beliefs, which also happens to be truthful beliefs. It's not just idiosyncratic beliefs, but the ability of business owners to run their businesses in accordance with their beliefs. This is where we see cases of bakers, florists, photographers, various people whose professional lives intersect with the wedding industry, whether or not they would remain free to run their business, to honor God in their commercial lives by honoring the truth about marriage. We've also seen this with charities, most particularly with adoption agencies, whether or not adoption agencies, foster care agencies, and even prospective foster parents and adoptive parents would be able to have a preference for finding homes for children in need with married moms and dads, with the idea being that an orphaned child deserves, whenever possible, both a mother and a father, and whether or not these agencies would be free to continue doing that. And it's important to highlight that in this case, they weren't preventing same-sex couples from going to other agencies, government-run agencies, secular agencies, progressive agencies. They just wanted the freedom to be able to run their agency in accordance with their beliefs. And we've seen that be an issue. There's currently a court case at the U.S. Supreme Court dealing with a Catholic adoption, a Catholic foster agency in Philadelphia. And then I would say that we've seen this in the education environment, whether or not schools would be free to have staffing decisions. Who's going to be a teacher at our faith-based school if they do or do not agree with the church's teaching about marriage. And so we've seen instances where schools have been sued, Catholic schools in particular have been sued because they didn't want an individual in a same-sex, quote, marriage to be embodying the faith, teaching the faith, witnessing the faith to students, because they were living in contradiction to the moral teachings of the faith. That would kind of go, and then we've seen threats. Most recently it was in the US context, it was Beto O'Rourke. He was running for president, and during one of the presidential debates, he said that not only schools, but possibly even houses of worship that didn't update their doctrines on marriage might lose their nonprofit tax status. And so these are just a whole host of things that it's been 5 years since, now I guess 6 years since marriage was redefined nationally by the United States Supreme Court. And, these things have been percolating. The other big outcome, I would say, has been the rise of the transgender question. Leading up to the marriage debate and the redefinition of marriage, we mainly were talking about the LGB part of the acronym. And as soon as the activists knew that they had secured victory on what they call marriage equality, they pivoted from the LGB to the T. And I would say that's been a big area of discussion in the States during the past 5 years or so, has been what exactly, how should we think about gender identity, gender dysphoria, transgender identities, et cetera, et cetera.
Our respective cultures seem to be drifting into what's known as a therapeutic age, with an anthropology prioritizing expressive individualism and harm minimization rather than the cultivation of virtue. What are some effective ways that religious freedom can be prosecuted in this age?
Well, it's a great question because there's a tension here, because you don't want to defend religious freedom as if it's just a kind of libertarian, individualistic, everyone should be free to do whatever they want to do, provided it doesn't physically harm another, like a J.S. Mill principle style argument. And so there's a tension there, and there's a concern there that you would make it seem like religious liberty is just another lifestyle choice. And it's just another, some people are interested in worshiping God and honoring God and living out, their entire lives conform to God. And other people are interested in, fill in the blank, checkers, chess, some hobby. And that, these things are equivalent, or even worse, some people are interested in, various forms of like what Helen Alvarez, a law professor at George Mason University, calls sexuality-ism, right? Where we've, elevated, sexuality as if it's, a fundamental liberty or a fundamental human right. So I think part of the challenge is really going to be stressing the transcendent element of religious liberty. The reason that religious liberty matters is it's about conforming one's life to a more than human source of meaning and authority and existence, right? A transcendent source. And some religions aren't transcendent, so that's why I use the more than human. Even if it's an immanent religion, it's still in some way more than human. There's a sociologist at Notre Dame, Christian Smith, who's written a little bit on that dynamic. But in general, I would just say it's you can use as a fill-in for kind of many of the Western religions that our listeners would be most familiar with: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. A transcendent God who places demands upon believers, and religious liberty is about creating the space for those believers to answer that call from God, right? And so it's about the most important things in lives, right? In life, these transcendental truths, these eternal truths, some of the most important, meaningful aspects of existence. And then second, it's about truth claims, right? That there are certain claims that religious believers hold to be true about God, about the universe, about morality, and that no earthly authority can override those claims. I mean, that would be my advice. That part of defending religious liberty is going to be defending religion itself, the nature of religion, the claims of religion, and not merely a freedom to be left alone in my idiosyncratic ways. The second thing I would say is that it also needs to be a defense of the underlying beliefs at stake. So not just a defense of like religion, and the concept of a creator God and, moral demands that a creator God places upon believers, but then also the specific moral teachings that are controversial. Notice that many religious liberty cases don't center on almsgiving or soup kitchens or homeless shelters, things like that. Many of them deal with claims about the right to life and the dignity of children in the womb, deal with the nature of marriage and the conjugal union of a husband and wife, and they deal with claims about our embodiment as male or female. Those are three areas, at least in the United States, where we see a lot of disputes over religious liberty. And so I think it's a mistake to only defend religious liberty on those three areas. We also need to defend the underlying truth about the dignity of the unborn life, about the nature of marriage, and about our embodiment as male or female, if progressives are successful in redefining those three truth claims as if those three truth claims are unlawful, bigoted discrimination, then I think it's a very challenging environment to defend religious liberty.
Last year, you wrote an article entitled "Religious Liberty is Important, but it's not enough." This might surprise people given that such liberty has been your focus for many years. Can you elaborate on why it's not enough?
Sure. I mean, so this flows, right from what we were just talking about, that, part of the reason why it's not enough is that if the emphasis is on the liberty part, not the religious part, you're not defending, promoting, explaining, the importance of religion itself, and therefore why we need religious liberty. But two, it's that many people, I fear, have fallen into the trap of defending religious liberty instead of defending the dignity of human life or the nature of marriage or our embodiment as male or female. And so, it's like safer ground, they think, to say, oh, I'm in favor of religious liberty, rather than saying, I am in favor of marriage as the conjugal union of husband and wife, or I'm in favor of, an understanding of our sexual embodiment as male or female, right? And I think the religious liberty part's important, but it's the freedom to then do the more important work of defending, the unborn life in the womb, defending the nature of marriage, defending our embodiment. That's the pay dirt, right? We want religious freedom in order to be able to do those other things. And then the last reason why I don't think it's enough is that there are all sorts of other people and other goods that are at stake in some of these debates. And what I mean by that is that, if you're having a debate right now about, an aspect of transgender public policy, realize that secular girls care about their privacy in a locker room. Secular girls care about their equality and fairness on the athletic field, right? It's not just religious girls who don't want, a boy who identifies as a girl in their bathroom. It's not just religious athletes who don't want a boy who identifies as a girl, taking away their athletic opportunities. This isn't just for religious believers, and it's also not primarily about religious liberty, right? This is about privacy for everyone, safety for everyone, fair athletic competitions for everyone. And so I also think there's a fear that people will put so much emphasis on religious liberty that they ignore some of these substantive policy concerns, right? If we're making public policy, if we're making law, religious liberty is important, but it's not the only thing that's important. We also need to make sure that we have good policies for bathrooms, locker rooms, homeless shelters, athletic competitions, and medicine, right? I mean, like, part of what we're now discovering on the gender identity front is that whether you're a religious high school girl or a secular high school girl, a double mastectomy is not the solution to your gender dysphoria. And again, religious liberty doesn't address that question. If you are a high school girl who feels uncomfortable in your sexed body, what is the appropriate solution? And we need to have that conversation on the merits.
We've witnessed many religious freedom victories over the last decade in the American Supreme Court. The Little Sisters of the Poor, Hobby Lobby, and the recent proselytizing case of the student in Georgia, to name a few. Are concerns about the looming Equality Act well-founded, given this solid track record from the Supreme Court in defending religious freedom?
Oh, yes. I mean, like, you are correct in saying that religious freedom has had some very important victories at the U.S. Supreme Court. But a couple of thoughts there is that, one, if you're litigating to defend your religious liberty, in a certain sense, you've already lost. Something had gone wrong that you had to spend possibly years of your life getting to the Supreme Court to have the Supreme Court tell the government they can't do what they were doing, right? The Little Sisters of the Poor have spent nearly a decade of their lives, fighting the federal government because the federal government has been trying to force them to violate their beliefs about human sexuality. And so even though, yes, they won at the Supreme Court, it's still not over for them. Now that we have the Biden administration, I think the Biden administration is already undoing some of the protections that the Trump administration afforded to religious institutions. And the Little Sisters of the Poor could very well see themselves back in court, right? So it's not kind of a done deal. But then the second thing to say about the Equality Act itself is that the Equality Act would be the first time in American history that Congress passed a law that exempted from the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And so the Hobby Lobby victory, the Little Sisters of the Poor victory, those were all litigated under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. That's how those religious institutions, religious business and a religious order of nuns, how they won at the Supreme Court. The Equality Act would say you can't use the Religious Freedom Restoration Act as a defense against this law. The Equality Act is just unspeakably broad and expansive in who would be regulated by the government. It imposes a sexual orthodoxy on the nation by elevating sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes akin to race. What this means is that it would take every law that we have at the federal level combating racism, it would expand the reach of those laws, and then say that if you believe that we are created male and female and that male and female are created for each other, you're going to be treated the way that we treat racists under the law. And then it's going to say, and you don't have the Religious Freedom Restoration Act as a possible line of defense. So the Equality Act would be a disaster for religious liberty in the United States. It would also be a disaster for all of those other areas that we were just discussing. For sports, for bathrooms, for locker rooms, for medicine, for adoption, for foster care. Just go through the list, both on the religious liberty front and on some of these substantive policy areas. What the Equality Act does is it imposes a sexual orthodoxy on the nation, and then it punishes anyone who believes the truth about human sexuality.
You were recently entangled in a censorship matter when your book on transgenderism, When Harry Became Sally, was banned by Amazon. Can you go through what happened there?
Sure. I mean, so this is, it's almost hard to know entirely how to answer that because we still don't fully know what happened there. In 2018, my book was published. It was over 3 years ago now. I believe it came out in March of 2018. Amazon sold the book for 3 years. It didn't violate the content policy because there's nothing inappropriate with the book at all. And then on a random Sunday afternoon, I got a message from someone trying to buy the book saying it's no longer for sale. We can't find it on Amazon. We can't find the hardback. We can't find the paperback. We can't find the Kindle, the ebook. We can't find the audiobook, Audible. We can't even find used copies of the book. And so I thought this had to be a mistake. Something went wrong with the software, the glitches that only seem to impact conservatives. But no, it was intentional, and they haven't backed down. We did the formal appeal process. Several members of the U.S. government, senators and House of Representatives and state attorneys general all reached out to Amazon inquiring what's the basis of this decision. And what they say now is that after 3 years, it violates their content policy because it's some form of objectionable hate speech. I think this is just the latest sign of kind of a woke capitalism, big tech flexing its muscles to censor voices and viewpoints that it finds threatening. The book was removed the weekend before the US House of Representatives was scheduled to vote on the Equality Act. I was one of the most outspoken, prominent critics of the Equality Act. It seems like what was going on here was a way of discrediting me as a scholar, as someone engaged in these public policy debates. It was clearly designed to do damage to my professional reputation, the way in which they've described the book and explained why to sell it any longer. And I think most importantly, it will have a chilling effect on the book market. Future authors won't want to write a book like this out of fear that it'll be delisted. Future publishers won't want to publish a book like this for fear of it being delisted. And the reason why is that Amazon controls in the United States, or maybe it's even globally, I forget the exact statistic, it's something like 70 to 80% of adult nonfiction book sales go through Amazon. So if you're writing a book for adults and it's, nonfiction, and you don't have access to Amazon, then you don't have access to the market. They are the marketplace. That's a quote from a couple of years ago, a story from the Wall Street Journal. Jeff Bezos said that, when he created Amazon, he wanted it to be the everything store, that they sell everything out there and that you could get it easily, quickly, et cetera, et cetera. And so for you to not have access to that digital marketplace, it's a new form of kind of book burning. It's a form of digital book burning. And it's even a worse form because there's no transparency, right? You don't get your day in court, right? Had a government censored the book, you could appeal, there would be a public hearing, there would be a certain amount of transparency. But when it's a monopolistic tech company, it's all done under the cover of darkness and secrecy, and there's not much you can do about it.
For the last couple of years, there's been debate about whether Western cultures must choose between whether they want to protect civil liberties on the one hand or uphold public morality on the other. Can you explain how this tension has emerged and what the best way forward is?
Oh, sure. There's a great book written, probably 30 years ago now. So sometime, I believe it was maybe 1991 or so, by a co-author of mine, Robert George. And Robbie's a professor at Princeton University. And the book that he wrote to get tenure at Princeton was actually titled Making Men Morals. And then the subtitle was something along the lines of on civil liberties and public morality. And Robbie was making a philosophical argument that governments need to do both, and that anyone who tries to force you into thinking we only do civil liberties, kind of a libertarian style, and we don't promote morality is misguided. And anyone who says we only promote public morality and civil liberties should not be part of the political common good is misguided. That the political common good needs to include both a meaningful protection for real, authentic civil liberties, human rights, things along those lines, and a meaningful promotion and defense of public morality. And what this means is that we need to be able to think about what the limits are of various civil liberties. All of our liberties have limits. And so whether it's religious liberty, there are going to be limits to religious liberty. Whether it's freedom of speech, there are going to be limits to freedom of speech. And just to use that example there, obscenity law, some people will view that as, oh, you're limiting my speech, where they include speech to mean printed materials, including printed images. And in the United States, we've been able to have, historically, we're moving away from this, is that a combination of both. Free speech for ideas, for arguments, for perspectives, for the give and take of evidence, reasons, where we can debate arguments, but not protection for obscenity, for things that are sexually inappropriate. And historically, we were able to do both of those things. Increasingly, what we're doing is we are we're doing a form of civil liberties with no limits, and then we are doing away with a promotion of public morality. And then that springs a counter reaction in which people want to promote public morality and ignore real, authentic, meaningful civil liberties. And that's partly because civil liberties have expanded to include things that aren't real civil liberties, aren't authentic human rights. And right, so as you have human rights inflation covering more and more areas that aren't authentic, it leads to a backlash of people saying just do away with the whole enterprise. So I think the important work going forward, the important intellectual work, right, the work that philosophers are going to have to be doing is the project of both civil liberties and public morality, and what justifies both of those things and what limits both of those things, and how do you deal with the gray zone, right? It's easy to paint in black and white, but where these things start rubbing up against each other, that's the tension that needs to be wrestled with and thought through, not ignored. I think some people try to do away with that tension by going all to one side or all to the other side. And I actually think that how you titrate that tension, how you navigate it, where the pendulum can swift too far in one way or the other way, how you get the virtuous mean. Aristotle said virtue is the mean between two extremes. That's going to be the challenge, I think, for Western nations in the years ahead.
Dr. Anderson, thank you very much indeed for speaking with us today on Talking Freely.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to be with you.
That's it for our latest episode of Talking Freely. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can do so through our website, www.freedomforfaith.org.au. Freedom for Faith exists through the generous donations of individuals and organisations across Australia. If you'd like to financially partner with us, you can do so through our website.